Captain Daniel Hayes stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge and watched the stars drift past the viewport. His crew had been exploring this sector for 3 months now, and they had found nothing but empty space and dead rocks. The ship hummed quietly around him as the night shift went about their duties. Lieutenant Sophie Martinez sat at her station, running language algorithms through the computer. She was the best xenolinguist in the fleet, and Daniel trusted her completely. The alarm broke the silence like a hammer through glass. Sophie's hands flew across her console and her eyes went wide. Daniel crossed the bridge in 4 quick steps and looked over her shoulder at the data streaming across the screen. There were signals coming from the third planet in this system, and they were definitely artificial. The patterns repeated in complex sequences that suggested intelligence and purpose. Sophie's fingers trembled slightly as she isolated the transmission and fed it through the translation matrix. Daniel called the senior staff to the bridge. Commander Jake Peterson arrived first, still pulling on his uniform jacket. Dr. Lisa Chen came next, followed by Lieutenant Ryan Cooper, who looked like he had been working out in the ship's gym. They gathered around Sophie's station and stared at the data. The signals were unlike anything in the galactic database. Sophie explained that the mathematical structure suggested language, but the syntax was completely foreign. What troubled her most was a nagging feeling of recognition, like seeing a face you almost remember from a dream. The horizon's edge moved into orbit around the planet, and the crew got their first good look at the civilization below. Cities covered 3 continents, and ships moved between orbital stations with practiced ease. The architecture was strange and beautiful, with towers that seemed to grow organically from the ground. Everything had a crystalline quality that caught the sunlight and threw it back in rainbow patterns. Daniel ordered a standard first contact package transmitted in Galactic Common. The response came within minutes. A shuttle launched from the surface and requested permission to dock. Daniel gave the order, and the crew prepared to receive their first alien visitors. The docking bay was cleared, and security teams took positions that were visible but not threatening. Daniel straightened his uniform and took a deep breath. Sophie stood beside him with a translation device in her hand, even though she suspected it would be useless. The airlock cycled, and the doors opened. The aliens were tall and elegant, with skin that looked like living crystal. Light moved through their bodies, in slow waves of color. Their leader stepped forward, and the crew could see intricate patterns etched into his skin that might have been decorative or functional, or both. He carried a staff that pulsed with soft blue light. When he spoke, his voice had a musical quality that made the air vibrate. Sophie's translation device chirped and struggled before producing choppy approximations of his words. The alien introduced himself as High Priest Zarketh of the Velthara. He said his people had been waiting for this moment for longer than their records could measure. The prophecies spoke of Skywalkers who would come speaking the tongue of the first ones. Daniel glanced at Sophie with confusion written on his face. They had only transmitted in Galactic Common, which was the standard trade language used by dozens of species. Zarketh seemed to understand their confusion, and his crystalline features shifted in what might have been a smile. The Velthara delegation was escorted to the conference room where refreshments had been prepared. Zarketh examined everything, with great interest, touching surfaces and listening to the hum of the ship's systems. He explained that his people were deeply spiritual and believed the universe spoke to those who knew how to listen. The Velthara had built their entire civilization around the stewardship of sacred knowledge passed down through generations. They maintained temples and archives that held the wisdom of ages. Daniel tried to establish basic diplomatic protocols, but Zarketh insisted on performing rituals first. He raised his staff and began to chant in a language that made Sophie's skin prickle. The staff's light grew brighter, and the ship's sensors went haywire. Ryan's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Daniel shook his head slightly. The ritual lasted 10 minutes, and when it ended, Zarketh seemed satisfied. He explained that he had been asking permission from the spirits of the ship to conduct negotiations. Over the next few hours, the 2 groups exchanged basic information. The Velthara had achieved spaceflight 2,000 years ago, but had chosen to remain in their home system. They considered themselves guardians, rather than explorers. When Daniel asked what they were guarding, Zarketh became evasive. He said there were things that must be shown, rather than told. The Velthara had temples that contained truths too important for mere words. Sophie noticed something strange during the conversation. Occasionally, Zarketh would use words or phrases that seemed to bypass the translation device entirely. She understood them on some level that had nothing to do with her training or education. It was like remembering something she had never learned. She mentioned this to Daniel privately, and he suggested she run a full diagnostic on her neural interface. The device connected her brain directly to the ship's linguistic database, and malfunctions could cause odd perceptions. The meeting ended with an invitation. Zarketh asked Daniel and his senior staff to visit the surface and see the sacred temples. He promised that many of their questions would be answered there. Daniel accepted cautiously, and arrangements were made for a shuttle to depart the next morning. The Velthara delegation returned to their ship, and the Horizon's Edge crew gathered to discuss what had happened. Jake expressed concerns about walking into a potential trap. Ryan suggested keeping the ship at high alert and maintaining constant communication with the away team. Lisa wanted to study the biological data they had collected on the Velthara. Sophie said nothing, but her mind was racing. Those fragments of understanding she had experienced during the meeting haunted her. She returned to her quarters and pulled up every linguistic database she could access. Hours passed as Sophie searched for patterns and connections. She cross-referenced the Velthara language. With thousands of known tongues, both living and dead, something kept pulling her toward Earth's ancient languages. She loaded files on Sumerian and Sanskrit and Proto-Indo-European. The computer flagged several structural similarities that should have been impossible. Languages separated by thousands of light years and millions of years of development should not share fundamental building blocks. Daniel found her still working when the morning shift began. Her eyes were red and her coffee had gone cold hours ago. She showed him what she had found, and he sat down heavily in the chair beside her. If the correlations were real, then the Velthara and humans shared some kind of deep linguistic connection. Either it was the most extraordinary coincidence in history or something was very wrong with everything they thought they knew about human origins. Daniel told her to get some rest and be ready for the surface mission. They would have answers soon, one way or another. The shuttle descended through layers of clouds that glowed with strange colors. Sophie pressed her face against the viewport and watched the Velthara cities grow larger below them. The crystalline towers caught the morning sun and threw light in every direction. Gardens spread between the buildings in geometric patterns that seemed to have mathematical precision. Jake piloted the shuttle with steady hands while Daniel reviewed their mission parameters one more time. Lisa ran bioscanners over the landscape and muttered about atmospheric readings that made no sense. Ryan sat quietly checking his sidearm even though Daniel had ordered all weapons set to non-lethal modes. They landed in a plaza, surrounded by the largest structures Sophie had ever seen. The buildings rose hundreds of meters into the air, and their surfaces were covered in carved symbols. A delegation of Velthara priests waited for them, and Zarketh stood at the front with his staff planted firmly on the ground. The humans emerged from the shuttle, and the warm air hit them like a gentle hand. It smelled of flowers and stone and something else that Sophie could not identify. The priests bowed in unison and began to chant. Zarketh led them through wide streets where Velthara citizens stopped to stare. Children pointed, and adults whispered behind their hands. The humans were clearly something special here. Sophie noticed that every building had symbols carved around the doorways and windows. The script was flowing and beautiful but completely unreadable. She activated her recording equipment and captured everything she could. The data would take years to analyze properly. They arrived at the central temple just before noon. The structure was massive, beyond comprehension, with walls that seemed to grow straight from the bedrock. Zarketh explained that this temple had stood for 10,000 years without requiring repairs. The builders had known secrets that modern Velthara could only guess at. Inside, the air was cool and dim. Light filtered through crystal panels in the ceiling and created moving patterns on the floor. Hundreds of priests moved through the space in quiet meditation. Zarketh took them deeper into the temple downstairs that spiraled into darkness. Glowing moss on the walls provided enough light to see by. Sophie counted 300 steps before they reached a large chamber filled with crystalline tablets. Each tablet was covered in dense script that glowed faintly. Zarketh gestured to the collection with obvious pride. These were the sacred texts that his order had protected for millennia. He invited Sophie to study them. She approached the nearest tablet and ran her fingers across the surface. The symbols seemed to shift under her touch. Her neural interface activated automatically and began trying to catalog the script. Warning lights flashed in her vision as the device struggled with the complexity. Sophie pulled up her analysis tools and started working. The mathematical structure of the language was elegant but strange. It used base 12 counting systems and incorporated tonal variations that normal human hearing could barely detect. Hours passed, and Sophie lost herself in the work. Daniel and the others explored the chamber with Velthara guides, who explained the history of each section. Jake found star charts that showed systems the humans had never seen. Lisa discovered what appeared to be genetic diagrams of dozens of species. Ryan stood guard near the entrance and watched everything with suspicious eyes. Sophie continued her analysis and began to notice patterns. The neural interface suddenly sparked and went dark. Pain shot through Sophie's skull and she cried out. Daniel rushed to her side, but she waved him away. The device had overloaded, trying to process too much data at once. Without the technological buffer between her mind and the symbols, something strange happened. Sophie looked at the tablet again, and the symbols began to make sense. Not through translation or analysis, but through direct understanding. It was like suddenly remembering how to read after years of forgetting. Words formed in her mind and spilled from her lips without conscious thought. The sounds were harsh and soft at the same time, with rhythms that felt older than mountains. She spoke of the first ones who came from the sky bearing gifts of knowledge. She spoke of the great work that spread consciousness across the void. She spoke of the children who were raised up to walk among the stars. The words flowed like water, and Sophie had no control over them. Zarketh went rigid. His staff slipped from his fingers and hit the stone floor with a crack that echoed through the chamber. The other Velthara priests fell to their knees, and their bodies began to resonate with a harmonic frequency. The sound grew louder, and the crystals in the chamber vibrated in sympathy. Light flared from every surface, and the temperature dropped sharply. Daniel grabbed Sophie's shoulders, but she kept speaking. The ancient words poured out of her in an unstoppable flood. The high priest dropped to his knees and pressed his forehead to the floor. Tears streamed down his crystalline face and left glowing trails. When he finally looked up, his eyes held wonder and terror in equal measure. He spoke in the same language Sophie had been using. His voice cracked with emotion as he called her the inheritor and the child of the progenitors. The other priests took up the chant, and the chamber filled with their voices. Sophie stopped speaking and swayed on her feet. Lisa caught her before she fell and helped her sit down. The xenolinguist's eyes were glazed and unfocused. She mumbled in half a dozen languages, including some that Lisa did not recognize. Daniel demanded answers from Zarketh, who was still kneeling on the floor. The high priest rose slowly and leaned heavily on his staff. His entire body was shaking. Zarketh explained that the Velthara had maintained their vigil for 10,000 years, waiting for this moment. The prophecies said that skywalkers would come speaking the tongue of the first ones. The Velthara had preserved the sacred texts in a language they could not fully understand. They had been caretakers of knowledge meant for others. Now those others had arrived and spoken the words that had been silent for millennia. Daniel felt cold spreading through his chest. He asked Zarketh who the first ones were. The high priest gestured to the tablets and the star charts and the genetic diagrams. The first ones were the progenitors who had seeded life across countless worlds. They had been the teachers and uplifters who raised primitive species to sentience. The Velthara and dozens of other races owed their existence to the progenitors, but the progenitors had vanished ages ago, leaving only their works behind. Sophie regained her focus and stood up on shaky legs. She told Daniel that she understood now. The language she had spoken was Proto-Sumerian, mixed with something even older. It was Earth language, but from a time before recorded human history. She did not know How she knew it, or why she could speak it. The knowledge had been locked somewhere in her mind, and the neural interface failure had released it. Zarketh approached Sophie with reverence. He asked if she was truly human from the world, called Earth. When she confirmed it, he began to weep again. The prophecies had named Earth as the home of the progenitors. The sacred texts described it in detail, though the Velthara had never been able to locate it. Now the children had returned, and they carried the ancient tongue in their very genetics. The circle was complete. Ryan interrupted and pointed out that this could be an elaborate deception. Maybe the Velthara had studied human languages and created this scenario to manipulate them. Jake agreed that they needed verification before accepting such extraordinary claims. Daniel looked at Sophie, who was staring at her hands like she had never seen them before. She said there was a way to test the truth. If humans really were the progenitors, then there would be evidence. Physical proof that could not be faked. Zarketh nodded slowly and said, such proof existed. Deep beneath the temple was a vault that had been sealed since the time of the first ones. The vault would only open for those who carried the blood of the progenitors. No Velthara had ever been able to access it despite 10,000 years of trying. If the humans were truly the inheritors, then the vault would recognize them. Daniel agreed to the test, and Zarketh led them deeper into the earth. The descent took over an hour through tunnels carved from solid rock. Emergency lights had been installed by the Velthara, but the original passages were completely dark. Sophie could see tool marks on the walls that looked precise and deliberate. Whatever had made these tunnels had used technology far beyond simple drilling. The air grew colder as they went deeper, and their breath began to fog. Lisa took readings and reported that they were now 3 kilometers below the surface. They emerged into a massive cavern that must have been natural originally but had been extensively modified. The floor was perfectly level, and the walls were smooth as glass. In the center of the space stood a door that made everyone stop and stare. It was 50 meters tall and 30 meters wide, made from material that looked like polished obsidian. Symbols covered every centimeter of the surface, and they glowed with soft blue light. Jake walked up to it and placed his hand on the surface. The material was cold enough to hurt. Zarketh explained that his people had tried everything to open this vault. They had used tools and prayers and scientific instruments. Nothing had ever produced even the slightest reaction. The door had remained sealed and silent for 10,000 years. According to the sacred texts, the vault contained the legacy of the progenitors, knowledge and power that was meant for their children alone. The Velthara had been told to guard it until the inheritors returned. Daniel approached the door cautiously with Sophie and Lisa beside him. Ryan stayed back with his hand near his weapon. The symbols on the door were similar to those on the tablets upstairs, but far more complex. Sophie felt her head begin to ache as she tried to parse the meaning. The neural interface was still offline, so she had to rely on that strange, intuitive understanding. The symbols spoke of bloodlines and inheritance and the burden of legacy. A small panel near the bottom of the door drew Lisa's attention. It was designed for someone human-sized to reach. The panel had a depression that looked like it was meant for a hand. Lisa pulled out her medical scanner and examined it carefully. The depression had what appeared to be genetic readers embedded in the surface. She looked at Daniel and explained that it was a DNA lock. The vault was programmed to recognize specific genetic markers. Daniel asked if there was any risk in trying to activate it. Lisa ran her scanner over the panel again and shook her head. As far as she could tell, it was simply a reader with no obvious weapons or traps. Jake suggested that if this was going to explode or release gas or do anything hostile, it would have done it when the Velthara tried to open it. Ryan disagreed and said they should send a probe first. Daniel considered the options and made his decision. He placed his hand on the panel. The cold surface tingled against his skin. For several seconds, nothing happened, and Daniel began to wonder if the vault had lost power over the millennia. Then light flared beneath his palm and spread outward in branching patterns. The symbols on the door began to pulse in sequence. A deep hum filled the cavern, and dust fell from the ceiling. The Velthara priests fell to their knees again and began chanting. The door split down the middle and swung inward without a sound. Air rushed out from the vault, carrying a smell of dust and age, and something else that reminded Sophie of old libraries. Beyond the door was darkness that their lights could not fully penetrate. Daniel pulled out a powerful flashlight and shined it into the vault. The beam revealed rows of what looked like storage units stretching back further than they could see. They entered the vault slowly with weapons ready despite the lack of apparent danger. The storage units were made of the same black material as the door. Each one was labeled in the same ancient script that Sophie had spoken earlier. She read the labels aloud, and her voice echoed strangely in the space. Historical records, genetic archives, technological specifications, cultural databases, the list went on and on. This was not just a vault. It was a library containing the complete knowledge of a civilization. Lisa found a control panel on the wall and touched it experimentally. Lights came on throughout the vault, revealing just how massive it truly was. The space extended for hundreds of meters in every direction. Rows of storage units were organized with mathematical precision. Holographic displays activated, showing interface options in the same ancient language. Sophie stepped up to the panel and began working through the menus. Her hands moved with confidence as though she had used this system 1,000 times before. Jake explored the nearest storage units and found that they could be opened with a simple touch. Inside were crystalline data storage devices that looked nothing like human technology. But somehow, he knew exactly how to activate them. He pulled one out and held it up to the light. Information began streaming into his mind without the need for any interface device. Images and concepts and knowledge flowed directly into his consciousness. He gasped and nearly dropped the crystal. Sophie accessed the main database and pulled up the historical index. What she found there made her sink to the floor with shock. The records showed humanity as an ancient spacefaring civilization that had existed hundreds of thousands of years ago. They had spread across this entire region of the galaxy, seeding life and uplifting primitive species. Dozens of intelligent races owed their existence to human intervention and guidance. The Velthara were just one of many children that humanity had raised. Daniel read over Sophie's shoulder and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The records showed Earth as the capital of a vast empire that had lasted for 50,000 years. Humans had developed technology that seemed like magic, even by current standards. They had manipulated genetics and physics, and even consciousness itself. They had been gods among the younger races, who worshipped and served them faithfully. But something had gone wrong. The records showed a war that had consumed entire star systems. An enemy had risen that threatened not just humanity, but all life in the galaxy. The details of the conflict were fragmented, but the outcome was clear. Humanity had been driven to the brink of extinction. Their great cities had burned, and their empire had collapsed. The survivors had made a desperate decision. Sophie found the file labeled The Forgetting Protocol and opened it with trembling hands. The document laid out a plan that was both brilliant and terrible. The remaining humans would flee to Earth, which had been kept as a nature preserve. They would use advanced technology to regress their own civilization and erase all memory of their spacefaring past. The genetic treatments would limit human lifespan and cognitive ability. Future generations would be born with no knowledge of what they had once been. The purpose was simple. The enemy had been hunting humanity across the galaxy. By becoming primitive and forgetting their past, humans would disappear from the galactic stage. They would be invisible to their hunters. The uplifted races like the Velthara would be given archives and instructions. They were to guard the knowledge and wait. When humanity eventually rediscovered space travel on their own and made peaceful contact, then it would be safe to reveal the truth. Lisa found the genetic archives and began comparing them to human DNA samples from the crew. The match was undeniable. Modern humans carried the same baseline genetic code as the ancient progenitors, but with significant alterations. The changes had been deliberately introduced to limit certain abilities. She found markers for extended lifespan that had been deactivated, cognitive enhancement genes that had been suppressed, physical capabilities that had been reduced to baseline levels. Ryan was reading through tactical archives, and his face had gone pale. The weapons technology, described in these files, was beyond anything the current galactic civilization possessed. Ships that could destroy planets, devices that could manipulate time, biological weapons that could reshape entire ecosystems. If humanity had access to this knowledge, they would be the most powerful force in the known universe. He turned to Daniel and asked what they were going to do with this information. Zarketh entered the vault and stood in silent awe. His people had guarded this place for 10,000 years, without knowing what it truly contained. Now, the inheritors had opened it, with a simple touch. He approached the storage units and ran his crystalline hands over their surfaces. The Velthara had fulfilled their purpose. The children had come home. He asked Daniel what humanity would do now that they knew the truth. Daniel had no answer. He looked at his crew and saw the same confusion and fear reflected in their faces. They had come out here, looking for new worlds to explore. Instead, they had discovered that humanity was not a young species reaching for the stars. They were the ancient masters returning to their domain. Every alien race they might encounter could be descended from species humans had created. The entire galactic order was built on foundations laid by their ancestors. Sophie stood and walked through the aisles reading labels and trying to comprehend the scope of what they had found. Philosophy and art and music from a human civilization that had existed before Earth's pyramids were built. Scientific theories that current humanity was still centuries from discovering. The complete history of dozens of species that humanity had guided from primitive beginnings to spaceflight. It was overwhelming. Jake found a section labeled Warning Protocols and felt dread settle in his stomach. He opened the first file and read about the enemy that had driven humanity into hiding. The details were vague, as though the ancient humans had been afraid to record too much. But the message was clear. The enemy had not been destroyed. They had simply lost track of their prey. If humanity announced their return too loudly or too soon, the old war might reignite. The crew gathered around Daniel as he made the hardest decision of his life. This information would change everything humanity thought they knew about themselves. It would shift the balance of power in the galaxy and potentially put Earth in danger. But keeping it secret seemed impossible. Zarketh had said the vault's opening would trigger signals across the galaxy. Other Guardian races would know that humanity had returned. The choice of whether to reveal the truth had already been made. The crew of the Horizon's Edge returned to their ship in silence. Each of them carried data crystals from the vault containing fragments of the impossible truth. Daniel sat in his ready room and stared at the crystal on his desk. Inside, it was the complete history of humanity's first empire, recorded in perfect detail. He had not yet found the courage to access it again. The weight of what they had discovered pressed down on him like a physical thing. Sophie spent 3 days locked in her quarters, learning to access the ancient knowledge without technological assistance. The Velthara priests had taught her meditation techniques that awakened something dormant in her genetic memory. She could now read the ancient script as easily as English. More disturbing was that she could feel other abilities stirring. The forgetting protocol had locked away more than just memories. It had suppressed cognitive functions that ancient humans had considered normal. Lisa worked in the medical bay analyzing the genetic data. She ran comparison after comparison, trying to understand the full scope of the alterations. Modern humans lived perhaps 100 years, if they were lucky. The genetic code showed that ancient humans had routinely lived for 5 centuries or more. She found markers for enhanced healing that could regenerate entire organs, neural pathways that allowed for parallel processing of information, metabolic efficiencies that eliminated the need for sleep. All of it locked away behind genetic suppressors. She called Daniel to the medical bay and showed him what she had found. With the right genetic therapies, they could potentially reverse the forgetting protocol. Humans could reclaim the abilities of their ancestors. Extended lifespans and enhanced intelligence and physical capabilities that would make them superior to almost any species in the galaxy. Daniel asked her if she was suggesting they should do this. Lisa admitted she did not know. The power was there, waiting to be used. The question was whether they had the wisdom to use it properly. Ryan spent his time analyzing the military archives with growing alarm. The weapons technology described in the files made him sick to read about. Humanity had created devices capable of cracking planets like eggs. They had engineered viruses that could wipe out entire species while leaving others untouched. The tactical doctrine showed a civilization that had absolute confidence in its military superiority. That confidence had led them to make enemies they could not ultimately defeat. He found files describing the enemy that had brought humanity down. The records were deliberately vague, and he suspected someone had purged most of the detailed information. What remained painted a picture of a conflict that had lasted thousands of years. The enemy had matched humanity's technological prowess and exceeded it in certain areas. They had destroyed human worlds one by one until only Earth remained. The final desperate gambit of the Forgetting Protocol had saved the species, but at terrible cost. Jake plotted courses and trajectories, trying to understand the scope of the old human empire. At its height, humanity had controlled over 300 star systems. They had established colonies and research stations and military outposts across thousands of light years. The Velthara system had been one of hundreds where humans had uplifted primitive species. Most of those species still existed, and they would all be receiving the signal that the vault had sent when it opened. Daniel called a staff meeting in the conference room. They gathered around the table, and the exhaustion showed on every face. None of them had slept properly since entering the vault. The knowledge they carried was too heavy to allow rest. Daniel asked each of them to give their assessment of the situation. He wanted to know what they thought humanity should do with this information. Sophie spoke first and said they needed to embrace their heritage. The ancient humans had been explorers and teachers who spread consciousness across the galaxy. That was a noble purpose, worth reclaiming. Modern humanity could take up that mantle again and work with the species their ancestors had created. They could rebuild the network of cooperation and learning that had once existed. The galaxy would be better for it. Ryan disagreed sharply. He argued that the records showed only what the ancient humans wanted to remember about themselves. Every civilization wrote its own history to make itself look good. The truth was that humanity had made themselves into gods, and that had led to disaster. The Forgetting Protocol was not just about hiding from enemies. It was about giving humanity a chance to start over without the burden of that failed empire. Lisa presented her findings about the genetic alterations. She explained that reversing the Forgetting Protocol was possible, but dangerous. Without proper preparation and safeguards, humans could become something inhuman. The ancient abilities came with ancient arrogance. She suggested they needed to be very careful about what parts of their heritage they chose to reclaim. Knowledge was one thing, but remaking themselves into their ancestors was another. Jake brought up the practical concerns. Within weeks or months, other species would arrive at the Velthara homeworld. Some would be friendly like the Velthara and welcome humanity's return. Others might see humans as a threat to the current galactic order. If word got out about the weapons technology in the vault, there would be panic. Every government in the galaxy would want to either acquire that knowledge or make sure humanity never accessed it. Zarketh joined the meeting with several other Velthara priests. Daniel had invited them to participate because this decision affected them as much as humanity. The High Priest explained that 23 guardian species had been established across the galaxy. All of them had received the signal from the vault. Ships were already being prepared to travel to this system. Representatives would arrive within 3 months. The return of humanity was no longer a secret that could be kept. The Velthara priest named Kael spoke about the burden his people had carried. For 10,000 years, they had maintained the temples and preserved the knowledge without understanding its full significance. Generations of Velthara had devoted their lives to this task. Now it was complete, and they found themselves uncertain. Were they still servants of humanity? Or had they evolved beyond that original purpose? The question troubled the entire Velthara civilization. Daniel acknowledged the weight of their service and thanked them. He said that whatever humanity decided, they would not be treating the Velthara, or any other species, as servants. Too much time had passed, and too much had changed. The galaxy that existed now was not the one ancient humans had created. Modern humanity would have to find their place in this new order, rather than trying to reclaim the old one. Sophie brought up another concern that had been troubling her. The ancient humans had used the forgetting protocol on themselves, but what about humans who were off Earth when it was implemented? The records showed that the Empire had millions of citizens scattered across hundreds of worlds. Not all of them would have made it back to Earth before the protocol was enacted. There could be human populations out there who never forgot. They might have continued on as the Empire collapsed around them. The implications made everyone go quiet. If other human groups existed, they might have very different ideas about what humanity should be. They might see Earth humans as inferior, degraded versions of the true human form, or they might have evolved in completely different directions over the past 100,000 years. First contact with other humans could be even more complicated than first contact with aliens. Lisa pulled up genetic records and pointed out markers that suggested the forgetting protocol had been customized for the Earth population specifically. The treatments had been designed to work with that particular gene pool. Other human populations would have had different genetic baselines. Without the protocol applied, they would have retained all their ancient abilities. She could not say whether any such groups survived, but the possibility existed. Ryan raised the question of the enemy. If humanity announced their return, would that bring the old foe back to finish what they started? The records suggested the enemy had stopped hunting humans after they disappeared from the galactic stage. A primitive civilization on a backwater planet posed no threat, but a humanity that reclaimed its ancient knowledge and power would be a very different matter. Revealing themselves might restart a war that had been dormant for 100,000 years. Zarketh offered the perspective of his people. The Velthara had studied the prophecies for millennia, trying to understand what they meant. The texts spoke of humanity returning not as conquerors, but as partners. The first ones had made mistakes, and the forgetting protocol was meant to give them a chance to learn from those mistakes. If modern humans tried to simply become what their ancestors were, they would repeat the same errors. Daniel sat back and absorbed everything that had been said. The burden of this decision was crushing. Whatever they chose would affect not just humanity, but dozens of other species. He thought about Earth and the billions of people who had no idea their entire history was a lie. They deserved to know the truth. But the truth came with dangers that could destroy them. He needed more time, but time was the one thing they did not have. Sophie suggested they send a message to Earth immediately. The government and scientific community needed to know what had been discovered. Let the leaders and experts on Earth help make these decisions. The crew of one exploration ship should not be determining the future of their entire species. Daniel agreed that Earth needed to be informed, but he knew the chaos that would follow. This information would shake human civilization to its core. The meeting continued for hours as they debated every angle. Finally, Daniel made his decision. They would transmit everything to Earth, with recommendations, but not directives. They would prepare for the arrival of the other guardian species and face those encounters with honesty. Most importantly, they would not make any decisions about genetic modifications or weapons technology without full consultation with Earth. The burden was too great for any one group to carry alone. The transmission to Earth took 6 days to prepare. Sophie and Lisa worked together to compile the most important data, while Jake verified encryption protocols. They could not risk this information being intercepted by other species before Earth was ready to handle it. Daniel recorded a personal message to the fleet admiral, explaining everything they had discovered. He watched his own face on the screen and saw the weight of exhaustion and responsibility written there. When he finished recording, he encrypted it 3 times. The message left the horizon's edge, traveling at light speed toward Earth. It would take months to arrive. In the meantime, the crew had to prepare for the arrival of the guardian species. Zarketh provided a list of the races that would be coming. The Korthaxi were a hive mind species that humanity had uplifted from insect-level intelligence. The Dren were aquatic beings who lived in zero-gravity environments, and communicated through bioluminescence. The list went on, and each species sounded more alien than the last. Sophie continued her studies of the ancient language and the meditation techniques the Velthara taught her. She discovered that with practice, she could access deeper levels of genetic memory. Images and sensations from ancient humans flooded her consciousness. She saw the great cities that had spanned entire continents. She felt the pride of creating new life and guiding it toward sentience. She also felt the terror of the war and the desperate flight to Earth. The memories were not quite hers, but they affected her as though they were. Lisa made a breakthrough in her research on the genetic modifications. She found that the forgetting protocol had been designed to degrade slowly over generations. Each successive generation of humans born on Earth had slightly more of the suppressors released. The process was meant to take 100,000 years. At the end, humanity would naturally regain most of their ancient abilities without needing intervention. Earth was currently about 80,000 years into that process. Modern humans were already more capable than the refugees who had first arrived. This discovery changed everything. The ancient humans had not intended for their descendants to remain limited forever. They had created a time-release mechanism that would restore humanity when it was safe. The problem was, the vault opening had accelerated the timeline. Other species now knew humanity was awakening. The carefully planned gradual revelation was being replaced by sudden confrontation. Lisa calculated that if left alone, Earth humans would reach their full potential in another 20,000 years. They did not have 20,000 years. Ryan discovered something disturbing in the tactical archives. He found contingency plans that ancient humanity had made in case the forgetting protocol failed. Hidden weapons caches scattered across dozens of star systems. Automated defense platforms that would activate if specific trigger conditions were met. The vault opening and broadcasting its signal might have been one of those triggers. He could not be certain, but the possibility existed that ancient human weapons were powering up across the galaxy right now. Daniel ordered a full scan of the Velthara system, looking for any anomalies. Within hours, they detected energy signatures from 3 locations in the outer system. Automated stations were coming online after 100,000 years of dormancy. Zarketh confirmed that the Velthara had always known about structures in their outer system, but had never been able to approach them. Defense fields kept everything away. Now, those fields were dropping, and the stations were sending recognition signals to the horizon's edge. Jake took a team in a shuttle to investigate the nearest station. What they found was both amazing and terrifying. The station was a weapons platform, the size of a small moon. Its systems were ancient but still functional. The reactors had been built to run for millions of years without maintenance. Weapon ports, capable of destroying capital ships, lined the surface. Everything was in standby mode, waiting for authorization codes. Jake realized with horror that the Horizon's Edge crew probably had access to those codes in the data they had taken from the vault. The first Guardian species arrived 2 months after the vault opened. The Dren came in ships that looked like living organisms. They communicated through patterns of light that Sophie's enhanced abilities allowed her to interpret. The Dren were deeply emotional about meeting humans again. Their entire culture was built around the teachings that ancient humans had given them. They had literature and art and philosophy all centered on humanity as the wise teachers who had given them consciousness itself. Daniel met with the Dren delegation and felt the burden of their expectations. They looked at him like he was sacred. They asked about the return of the Empire and when humanity would resume their role as guides. Daniel explained carefully that modern humans were not the same as the ancient progenitors. Earth had spent 100,000 years developing in isolation. They had their own culture and values now. They could not simply step back into the role their ancestors had played. The Dren were confused and disappointed. Their prophecies had promised the return of the teachers. They had maintained their faith across thousands of generations. Now the teachers were saying they did not want to teach. One of the Dren elders asked what purpose the Guardian species had if not to serve humanity. The question cut deep because Daniel had no good answer. These species had built their entire civilizations around, waiting for a return that was not happening the way they expected. More species arrived over the following weeks. The Korthaxi brought gifts of biological technology that made Lisa's head spin. The Vex offered mathematical proofs that Sophie could barely comprehend. The Talamar presented artistic works that moved Jake to tears. Every species approached humanity with reverence and hope. Every species expected humans to provide leadership and direction. The pressure was immense. Not all the arrivals were friendly. A species called the Nyrak came with warships and demands. They had thrived in humanity's absence and built an empire of their own. The Nyrak had no interest in bowing to ancient masters. They wanted the weapons technology from the vault and threatened war if humanity did not share it. Ryan prepared the Horizon's Edge for combat, but Daniel refused to escalate. He met with the Nyrak commander and spoke honestly about human limitations. The commander was skeptical until Daniel proved that humans did not have access to the ancient weapons. The vault had given them knowledge, but not the ability to use it. Modern humans lacked the genetic modifications and cognitive enhancements needed to operate progenitor technology safely. The Nyrak withdrew their threats, but made it clear they were watching. If humanity ever regained their full capabilities, the Nyrak would respond with force. Sophie proposed a solution during another staff meeting. She suggested that humanity should not try to be what they once were. Instead, they should offer something different. Modern humans had spent 100,000 years learning to be humble and curious. They had developed science through careful observation rather than genetic memory. They had built democracies and philosophies based on equality rather than superiority. These were valuable perspectives that ancient humanity might have lacked. Daniel seized on this idea and proposed it to the assembled guardian species. Humanity would share the knowledge from the vault freely with all species. They would not claim ownership or demand service. In exchange, they asked to be treated as equals rather than masters. The role of teacher and guide could be filled collectively by all species working together. Humanity would contribute their unique perspective developed through the forgetting protocol, but not dominate. The proposal caused intense debate among the guardian species. Some, like the Dren, felt it was a betrayal of the prophecies. Others, like the Nyrak, were suspicious of human motives. The Velthara eventually broke the deadlock. Zarketh spoke about the wisdom of the forgetting protocol. Ancient humanity had recognized their own flaws and chosen to start over. Modern humanity was offering to share power rather than reclaim it. This was exactly what the prophecies had actually promised. Even if people had misunderstood them for millennia, one by one, the guardian species accepted the proposal. It would take time to adjust expectations and reorganize galactic politics around this new reality. Many species would struggle with the loss of their prophesied future. But the alternative was conflict, and humanity had proven they did not want that. Sophie worked with representatives from each species to begin translating and distributing the vault's knowledge. It would take centuries to process everything, but the work began immediately. Lisa received authorization from Earth to begin careful study of the genetic modifications. A team of experts was being assembled to determine which ancient abilities could be safely restored and which should remain suppressed. The process would take decades and involve extensive testing. There would be no rushing into reversing the forgetting protocol. Humanity would reclaim their heritage slowly and thoughtfully, or not at all. Ryan worked with the Velthara to secure the weapons platforms. The systems were put into permanent standby mode, with access codes distributed among multiple species. No single group would be able to activate them. If the ancient enemy ever returned, the galaxy would face them together. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but prevented any one species from having overwhelming military advantage. Jake began training programs to teach humans and other species how to operate ancient technology safely. The learning curve was steep even with genetic memory assistance. Modern minds had to be carefully prepared to interface with progenitor systems. He estimated it would take a full generation before anyone could use the technology at even a fraction of its design capacity. That was fine. They had time now. Daniel recorded a final report to send to Earth. He stood in his ready room and looked at the data crystal on his desk. Inside was the complete record of everything that had happened. The discovery of the vault, and the revelation of humanity's past, and the choices they had made about their future. He thought about the ancient humans who had enacted the forgetting protocol. They had sacrificed everything they were to give their descendants a chance at something better. In his report, Daniel explained that humanity had been given a choice. They could reclaim their position as masters of the galaxy, or they could forge a new path as partners and equals. The crew of the Horizon's Edge had chosen partnership. They had turned away from the power and prestige of their heritage in favor of cooperation and shared growth. Daniel believed it was the right choice, but he acknowledged that others might disagree. Earth would make its own decisions about what kind of civilization humanity would become. Sophie stood beside him as he finished the recording. She had changed in the months since the vault opened. The ancient knowledge had awakened something in her, but she remained fundamentally herself. She told Daniel that she had accessed memories of the last days before the forgetting protocol was implemented. The ancient humans had been afraid, but also hopeful. They believed their descendants could be better than they had been. Looking at what modern humanity had achieved, she thought they had been right. The Horizon's Edge remained in the Velthara system for another year, coordinating the knowledge transfer and helping to establish new diplomatic frameworks. Other human ships arrived from Earth, bringing scientists and diplomats and philosophers. The galaxy was reorganizing itself around humanity's return, but it was a gradual process. There was no sudden shift to human dominance. Instead, a new era of cooperation was beginning. Zarketh performed a ceremony in the Great Temple to mark the end of the Velthara's vigil. For 10,000 years, his people had guarded the vault and maintained the faith. Now, their purpose was complete. He spoke in the ancient language that Sophie had taught him, and she translated for the assembled humans and aliens. The high priest said that the first ones had left a gift more precious than technology or power. They had left time. Time for their children to grow and learn and become worthy of the inheritance. Daniel realized that was the truth of it. The forgetting protocol had not been a punishment or even a hiding strategy. It had been a gift of time and humility. Ancient humanity had reached too high, too fast, and paid the price. Modern humanity had been given the chance to climb more carefully, with wisdom earned through struggle. They were reclaiming their heritage not by becoming what their ancestors were, but by building on what their ancestors had learned. As the ceremony ended, and the crowds dispersed, Daniel looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there might be the ancient enemy, or other human populations or wonders they had not yet imagined. The galaxy was vast and full of mysteries. Humanity was no longer alone in facing them. They had partners and friends, and shared purpose. It was not the glorious return that prophecy had promised, but it was something better. It was a new beginning, built on the foundations of the past, but not constrained by it.